Hello, and welcome to the Culture Track at the third annual Python Web Conference. I'm Laura from 6 Feet Up, and I'm thrilled to welcome Casey Watts as our next presenter.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this talk. I think you'll like it a lot. All right, let's do screen sharing. All right, welcome to Debugging Your Brain. Before I jump into the content, I want to introduce myself a little bit. I like to blow bubbles in the park in DC. I like to play instruments. I have one in every color of the rainbow, and I love to dance. And I love teaching, and you'll probably hear that in my voice as we go through this talk. I've worked in tech for 10 years, recently at USCIS and Heroku. I've been in a ton of roles, product manager, engineering manager, engineer. Lately, I'm doing freelance work, training teams to be more happy and more effective, and coaching individuals. A long time ago, I did some neurobiology research. The Pop Science article written about this would have said that we erased memories in rats. But in science terms, no, we did not. We did something very specific that I'm not going to go into today. All right, what's the structure of this talk? I'm going to be giving a presentation and then do an activity, and we'll alternate between those two as we go through. The activities will be in Slack, so if you don't have that open, please do. The track 4 culture room is where we're at. And feel free to ask questions in there too. I'm going to start with what to debug, and then we'll go into how to debug. All right, what do we even debug in the first place? There's a phenomenon you've probably experienced called a downward spiral. It's when you have negative thoughts leading to negative feelings, leading to more negative thoughts, and you just feel worse and worse and worse, and it can be very counterproductive. Usually you want to short circuit these so you don't go super deep, and instead you think about something productive. Another term related to this is rumination, which is when you focus on the causes and consequences of a bad situation instead of focusing on solutions and being productive in that environment. So I'll give you 3 examples of when I've had a downward spiral and maybe ruminated, or yeah, and hopefully these are relevant to you. One is having an argument at work. So I thought I had a really good idea, and someone else thought they had a great idea, and we kind of butted heads over it. We each thought we were right, and then I felt like I was being too pushy, and I felt like a bad coworker, and I just felt worse and worse about it. But really, I was trying to convey my perspective, which was productive because I care a lot. That's a downward spiral. Another one was snapping at your kids. If you're a parent, you know kids can get on your nerves sometimes. Once my mom snapped at my younger brother for leaving the door open, and then she felt bad. She felt like she was being a bad parent. She wasn't being thoughtful and kind, and worse and worse and worse. Here's a third example. Once I was going to a meetup and I was hangry and running late, and I was wet and stepped in a puddle. And I found out there wasn't even going to be pizza at the meetup. So I was very upset. And I thought maybe I shouldn't even go. I'm glad I went. I caught myself. I caught the downward spiral and did a lot of the techniques in this talk. All right, for the individual activities, I want you to use Slack, like I said. You can first think about your response to yourself and then paste them into the sidebar. We're not doing pair activities. All right, first activity. I'd like you to come up with 3 challenging experiences from the past month when you had or almost had a downward spiral, and share those in the chat. And then you'll choose one of these for the future activities that we're doing. All right, we're at time. Please share what you have. I see some already. Starting a new job, moving very far away, 5,000 miles, buying a house. Husband had a major surgery and is rehabbing. Having a 16-year-old, I can imagine just that sentence, sure. COVID keeping me seeing people face to face. And getting frustrated with my son when he doesn't listen right away. Yeah, these are great. These are certainly stressful. And they all sound like they could have you downward spiral if you're not in a good state or if you're not careful at countering it. I see a couple more coming in. We'll use these experiences to frame the rest of the talk. So thank you for sharing yours and thinking about it critically so that you'd have this to frame the techniques around. Elizabeth says imposter syndrome issues. Oh, totally. I imagine there are certain moments when that flared up too. All right, feel free to keep sharing if you're in the middle of typing. I'm going to go forward in the talk. I have a resources index. Oh, let me paste that into the sidebar now. It links to the slides, the handouts on the website that I reference sometimes. There's a distortions list that comes up at the very end of the talk, ways you can connect with me and give feedback. Let me get that link. Here's the reference page for you to have it. You don't need to open that now, but you might want to save it. Being in lockdown, taking care of a newborn, not being able to visit relatives. Yeah, these all sound very stressful. Oof. Right, on the resources that I linked to there are these 3 handouts linked through it. One is an overview of concepts that we're about to go through in this talk. The one in the middle is a worksheet you could pull out to go through a certain experience like the ones we're listing here. They're kind of similar, but the one in the middle prompts you to answer questions, whereas the left one is just a quick guide. And then there's a bunch of one-time activities like additional reading you might want to do. Those are all linked to there. All right, so now we have an idea of what kinds of challenging experiences we're working with. How can we help more people effectively deal with these sorts of things? Like in general, how do we teach people? One way is therapy. If you have a therapist, they're kind of like a personal trainer for your brain. They help teach you techniques and help you practice those techniques to deal with these. But not everybody has access to that, of course. One common type is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is focused on noticing automatic thoughts and automatic feelings and countering them. CBT as a talk therapy is so common and effective. It treats so many mental illnesses. It's almost more interesting to list what it doesn't treat because it helps with so many things. For treating depression, for example, CBT is as effective as antidepressant drugs if you had just one or the other. I like to reframe cognitive behavioral therapy to call it cognitive behavioral training because the ideas and principles in it really apply to everyone, whether or not you have any kind of mental illness or if you're in a crisis or not. It doesn't matter. These skills help you in life. I also take ideas from dialectical behavioral therapy, which is another common one. This one focuses a little bit more on validating yourself and others. And we have a section on that. In particular, the 6 levels of validation we'll cover. Therapy is great, but there are a ton of barriers. So not everybody gets access to therapy, including stigma around it, financial barriers. Even if you get over the stigma and financial barriers, it's hard to find a good match that's compatible with you. And so I'm really into approaches other than therapy to teach these ideas. One is reading a book like Feeling Good by David Burns. This one popularized CBT. It took it to the masses. So you could just read the book instead of going to therapy or in addition to going to therapy. That one is very long. And so last year I finally wrote a very, very short version of that brings in the ideas of CBT and DBT for people to just learn on their own at home. The audiobook is only an hour and a half. It's super short. It's a lot like this talk, which you're going through. So you probably are going to have the same content here. I'm also working on a board game version, so it's more interactive. And that's a little bit like the activities we're going through. In the board, you process an experience from left to right, from unaware all the way through to resolved. And in, this talk is basically the structure too, left to right. Yeah, so this is our roadmap: introspection in general, identifying inputs, and then articulating and processing experiences, and then validating, and then cognitive restructuring. And you're going to get all of this content in the amount of time we have together, at least the overview of each one. So jumping in, first section is introspection. We're going to start by systems modeling the brain, like we developers are wont to do. Here's a very common model, the input process output model. You might recognize it because it looks a lot like a function. Functions have inputs and they have return values and they do stuff in the middle. In the general form, this is called the IPO model, input process output. We can model animals like that in the traditional, always quoted Pavlov's dog experiment. Pavlov would ring a bell and a dog would start salivating because Pavlov had trained the dog to associate the bell with getting food. And he could measure the amount of milliliters of saliva the dog produced. In humans, we like to think the process part in the middle is very important because we think thoughts. But actually, we're often on autopilot, just like Pavlov's dog seemed to be. There's an automatic part in the middle that our habits are that just run things when we're on autopilot. But we can switch to a mindful mode. We can switch to manual when we remember to, when we think to, and it's a good idea. But that can be tricky. How do you get into this manual mindful state? I have a technique that I'll share with you that I use, the Woop Technique. So, remember the story my mom was yelling at my little brother for the door? She noticed she was frustrated and she had this problem. And then my brother and I went, whoop! We surprised her. She had agreed that we could do this to her when she's feeling that way. And then she took a moment to think. She entered the whoop state. That loud whoop prompt helped her realize this is a good time to switch from autopilot to manual and become mindful. And then she thought about her problem and she realized, oh, I haven't eaten today. No wonder I'm frustrated at little things that don't normally bother me. So getting into that state was very impressive. I'm so proud my mom is good at doing that when she remembers to. But the prompting yourself to remember to is often the hard part. Yeah, switching, when you whoop, you switch from autopilot to manual, just like that. If you can do that reliably or at all, it's important to celebrate it. Once you're in the mindful state, it can feel worse if you don't know what to do next. But even just knowing to do that step is really powerful. And I hope you can say, good job, myself. I sure noticed that this was an opportunity to do something, even if I don't know what to do. Yeah, I'm not going to get to hear you do it, but I'd like you to try it. Ready? Let's whoop on 3. 3, 2, 1. Whoop! There you go. Feel free to do it out loud or in your head if that makes it easier in the situation you're in. All right, next section, identifying inputs. So now you're really good at getting into the mindful state, or you find yourself in one all of a sudden. What do you do first? I like to start with identifying inputs. Thanks, Chrissy. I love it. Posting whoop in the chat. All right, identifying inputs. Here, I'd like to share the idea of inner versus outer brain, because that helps think about what the inputs are. This GIF illustrates it pretty well. The cat turns around, jumps out of the way. It's a cucumber. It probably notices right after. There's a fast reaction, the jump, which might have saved the cat's life if that was a true danger. And then a slower response, which is investigating. The fast part, broadly speaking, happens in the inner brain where more emotion happens. And the slower part happens, broadly speaking, in the outer brain where more thought happens. The outer brain is an older part of the brain, evolutionarily speaking. The inner brain is technically called the limbic system, and the outer brain is the cortex, to put it into neuroscience terms. Broadly speaking, feelings are fast and thoughts are slow. Feelings are on the order of milliseconds, thoughts are on the order of seconds. That's like 1,000 times different. For inputs, I like to break the inputs into 4 different categories. It helps me search to find out what mine are. And then there are 2 things that are not inputs I want to call out that are under the process section there. The ones under the process are under your control, so I wouldn't consider those inputs. But the ones that are not under your control, you did not make them happen yourself, I consider inputs. All right, so 2 of the inputs are automatic thoughts and automatic feelings. This is like when you stub your toe and you let out a curse word. You probably didn't think, oh, should I curse right now? Yes or no? Yes, I will curse. It probably just happened. It came out of your mouth. And the feeling of stress when an event happens to you. You didn't decide, should I feel stressed? Yes, let me feel stressed. So anyway, those are inputs. A lot of our experience as humans are automatic thoughts and automatic feelings. They just happen automatically. We can think deliberate thoughts when we're being very mindful and we're thinking about things more deeply, and those are under our control. And we can influence our feelings through those deliberate thoughts and like change the way we feel by thinking a different way. So those are two things under our control. Two other types of inputs that are outside of our control include external stimuli, like stuff happening to you, like my little brother leaving the door open, that happened to my mom, or bodily state, like my mom being hangry in that moment. That wasn't really under her control, although her actions maybe could have eaten earlier in the day. But in that moment, her state was hangry, and that's an input to her response to it in the moment. Yeah, hangry. Yep. So when I'm trying to think about how I got to the mental state that I'm in, I go through these 4 categories to help me identify all the types of inputs. Often my bodily state is off, and I don't notice that until I do this kind of input search. Or any of the others. I miss each one sometimes. Here's a different representation of it. So your automatic inputs include automatic thoughts and feelings, your bodily state, and then stuff that's not inside you are external stimuli. One way to get good at identifying your inputs is mindfulness meditation. It's a practice where you sit with your thoughts. Don't judge them so that you feel worse and worse and have a downward spiral, but just observe them as inputs, as data into the system of your mind. And this has a lot of research behind it. There's studies that show mindfulness meditation really help with a whole bunch of things, including reducing stress and giving you more like introspective awareness of yourself. Skipping that one. All right, that's the identifying input section. So now you're able to get into a mindful state using Woop. You can identify inputs of those 4 categories. And next up is processing the experience, putting it into words and thinking about it more deeply. For this section, we have a bunch of approaches. None of them will be too surprising. The hard part is often figuring out which one to do when and remembering that these are all options. We'll go through them one at a time. Thinking. One thing to look out for when thinking is to not have negative thoughts and feelings, not ruminate. Thinking is the easiest one to do these in. Thinking is like the trickiest of the bunch. So often I suggest not just thinking to yourself if it's stressing you out, to shift gears into a different approach. My favorite approach of all of them is to talk to a friend. So you're the robot here, talking to a friend. When you talk to a friend, you can put what you're experiencing into words. That's the arrow message being sent. You can ask them to actively listen and like reflect back to you what you're saying, and then they are internalizing it and saying it back to you. So you're sure the message was received. You have like a receipt or a checksum, like, yes, they understand me. Sometimes you can ask for active help. You can ask them to brainstorm with you or come up with different ways to put into words what your experience is. That's powerful too. And if you don't have a friend around or you're not ready to talk to one, you could even imagine a friend and what they would respond with. And that can be really helpful too. Sometimes I do that in the form of writing. I'll write something to my friend and imagine their response. And that helps me get out of the thinking trap of downward spiraling by accident as I'm shifting into the writing mode. My next technique is to talk to a duck or a cat or a plant, whatever you have around that you can talk to. By verbalizing and putting your experience into words out loud, it makes it a lot more concrete. It's easier to like deal with and manipulate in your mind and inspect. And just saying it out loud is valuable. They don't even have to understand or respond for you to get value out of that. And you might do that with friends sometimes. Say, can I just talk at you? It's kind of similar to talking to an object or a creature that can't talk. Yeah, they can't really talk back, but you can imagine what they might say. Does anyone talk to your cat or duck? Feel free to comment in the chat. What or who do you talk to when you just need to say things out loud? I see Ben has a duck. Is there a cape on the duck? That's so cool. A lot of people this year have been talking to plants. Plants are like a COVID phenomenon of some kind. Me too. This is new for COVID. All right. My next technique is writing. So this is you just writing stuff down, not necessarily to a friend. One of the benefits of writing is you can reread what you wrote. It's perfectly reflecting back what you said to it, because that's all it can do, the paper or the place you were typing into. You can then edit, so you can say it back a different way, and then have a cycle of editing and editing until what you've written feels accurate. Writing is super powerful. Therapists prescribe writing, usually they say journaling, to their clients all the time. Another technique is reading. So in this case, you're not saying or sharing anything from your life, but if you read something that feels relevant, whether it's fiction, a fictional character in a similar situation, or nonfiction, like Ask a Manager, sharing stories about work, that can be pretty helpful to help you put things into words also. All right, my next technique here is expanding emotional vocabulary. There are a ton of references to help you find just the right word to describe your experience. A lot of us end up using just the header of this table, for example, the most simple, basic, common words. We understand plenty more, but we don't all use the rich vocabulary that exists for us. Here's a nice one that's circular and has nice colors. But my favorite emotional vocabulary reference is this one, Parrots Emotions by Groups. I got this from the Wikipedia page for it, which is linked to from the notes. For an example, when I'm feeling angry, I might zoom in and say, is it irritable or rage or disgust? Well, it's not disgust. I'm feeling more irritable. And then I can drill in another layer deep and say, is it just annoyed? Am I grouchy in general or grumpy? Am I agitated? So coming up with richer words can help you convey your experience more clearly to others and understand it better yourself. Right, these are all in the resources. No, I don't want to do that right now. All right, next section. Validation. Validation means accepting another person's experience as understandable, whether or not you agree with that person. I guess I didn't include a slide saying where we are, so let me tell you. We covered first the Woop technique to become introspective, and then we covered what the 4 inputs are. So you take stock of what's going on, and meditation helps with that. Then we covered a whole bunch of techniques to help you process experiences. And I talked about the pros and cons of each one. Now that you've put this into words, the next step in the board game and in real life is to make sure what you've come up with is correct and true and clear. And this is using validation. You can validate yourself or you can validate other people. But either way, you want to make sure it's right. I think the term makes a lot of sense to developers intuitively because you want to validate your data. You want to make sure your data is correct. So the term here is a little bit nuanced compared to the developer's definition of it. And that's saying that it's understandable. So it's like that the process was understandable, not necessarily the inputs. You feel the way you feel and you think your automatic thoughts. Anyway, those are inputs, but then validation validates the rest of it. When you're listening to a friend, you want them to feel understood. That's the goal for this stage. You can validate other people. You can ask other people to validate you, and you can also validate yourself. There are these validation levels. I put them into 3 groups. These are the 6 levels of validation from Marsha Linehan, creator of DBT, and then I've tried to make this easier to digest and remember for people with my groups on the left. We'll go through each one of these levels. So there's two sections here, basically. One is listening, and the other one is validation itself, where you say, it makes sense. For this section, I want you to imagine you're listening to a friend and trying to validate them really deeply. You want them to feel understood. And if you can model this technique, hopefully people can do the same for you, or you can ask people explicitly to do the other side of this. But for this, the perspective is flipped. You're on the right here. The lowest level of validation is literally just being present. If you're just in the same room as them, if you're just available on text and they know it, they can feel your presence, and that can be supportive in a really powerful way. The next one is listening. Oh, my arrow is backwards. Whoops. Oh, no, it's not. Sorry. You're on the left and your friend is processing on the right there. There we go. So anyway, your friend is sharing their story with you and you're just listening. This helps your friend put their experience into words, just like when you're talking to your pet or your plant. And this is the second level of validation. This is stronger than just being present, but there are other ones that are even stronger. You can, on the third level, accurately reflect what your friend is telling you. So you are thinking about it and then putting it into your own words and sharing it back. And that's even stronger than just sitting there listening. And the fourth level, this should look pretty familiar from before, from the talking to friends section, is thinking about it more deeply. In this case, I'm calling this careful guessing. So you're hearing what their experience is, how they're describing it, and then you're putting it into words. You're coming up with new words maybe, but doing it in a very careful way so that if you're wrong, they can correct you. If you guess wrong, that's invalidating. That's making them feel worse, making them feel misunderstood, or making them question the way that they're seeing the world and viewing the situation at all, and like causing more turmoil. So you definitely don't want to guess wrong. But if you guess correctly, it can be super powerful. It can be so validating and make them feel understood. Like, oh, my experience makes so much sense. The other person could figure it out without even me saying all of it. So it's a tough balance between guessing wrong, guessing right. How do you gauge the balance, and what techniques do you have to do this effectively? The key is to leave room for correction. So if you're going to guess about someone's experience to them, you want to know whether you're right or not. You want to help them feel comfortable correcting you if you're wrong. And that can be hard to do. There are two techniques here I'll share. They're pretty similar. One is the open-close spectrum. So if you have an open-ended question, like what did that feel like? That leaves a lot of room for them to tell you. In fact, you're not even assuming anything. You're not guessing here, and that's the most open. On the other end at the bottom here, closed, saying, that's so unfair. If they don't think it's unfair, they then have to say, no, I disagree. And that takes more effort and energy, and that's harder if you're guessing wrong. But if you're guessing correctly, that's unfair, then that's super validating because they feel understood without even having said it. I often go to the middle. So I say something like, did that feel unfair? So I do have a guess. I'm actively listening enough. I have an idea of how they're feeling. And then I'm also asking it as a question. So there's plenty of room for them to tell me if that was right or not, or to like refine their messaging. The other technique is very similar to this one, confidence level. So I like to express my confidence explicitly. So I could say things like imagine or guess or must have or I'm sure, I said in the other one. And so I say things with high confidence that I'm confident about. And I say things with low confidence that I am willing to have corrected, that I'm encouraging them to correct me on. So these two together, open, close, and confidence level, help make room for people to correct your guesses. So we just went through the first four levels there. And there's 3 more coming up. Any questions on this section before I move on? Feel free to ask in the chat. All right, I don't see anyone typing. We'll go on. All right, the validation section. So you're listening to your friend, You were present with them, you were listening to them, reflecting to them, and even carefully guessing sometimes in the conversation. What can you do that's even more powerful than those is next, sharing that it makes sense given their situation, or it makes sense for anyone, or it makes sense to you personally. And like, how does their experience make sense? So the first part is just saying, you had this experience, I see it, I understand it, I hear it. The second section is saying, I understand and it makes sense. And that's where validation really starts to happen. Right, the first one here is that it makes sense for you based on your past. So I had a friend as a kid growing up. He was afraid of dogs, and he wouldn't even come near my dogs, which are really cuddly and nice, and they just wanted to be pet all the time. But it made sense for him. Once he told me that he was attacked by a dog as a kid, I totally understand how he could be afraid of dogs specifically for him. The next level, which is stronger than the first one actually, if that friend and I were walking down the street and a snarling dog we were walking past a yard with a snarling dog in it, it makes sense for anyone to be afraid of that dog because the dog is like showing that it's threatening. So I wouldn't necessarily lean on that he was afraid of a dog as a kid because he was attacked. I might do both maybe, but it makes sense not just for him. It makes sense for anyone walking by a snarling dog that you might be afraid of it. What if it jumps the fence and gets you? So often anyone is more powerful than just you specifically, your background. But then the even stronger one is that I would be afraid of that snarling dog too when we're walking by. Like, I'm afraid of the dog is better than anyone would be afraid of the dog is better than makes sense you would be afraid of the dog based on your background. But they're all valuable, and you should be searching for which of these you can use when you're trying to support a friend. So to visualize these three, I have this diagram. The strongest, or the weakest one is you. It makes sense based on your background. The next strongest is it makes sense for anyone. And then the most strong of the three is it makes sense for me too. I share the experience with you. So I'm including myself in the anyone. And I want to call out a difference. This isn't just me too in theory. This is me too. I have that experience now, or have had that experience before. All right. So in summary here, we've got the listening for and the validating three. When you're in a conversation with a friend, you want to validate them as much as you can. You can't necessarily start with the highest level at the bottom there, because your friend needs to feel understood enough for that to be something they can accept and hear and listen to and understand. So you can't just jump to the top. You often need to use all of these skills at different times when you're supporting a friend. So you might enjoy this framework, but how can you put it into practice? I find it useful to have a reference nearby before or after or during a conversation with a friend, so I can think about which ones am I doing, or which ones did I do, which ones do I plan to try to do. Cool, thanks, Lara. Yeah, so having a reference helps navigate this a lot. When I learned about these, I would reference the article every week or two for months until I finally really started to internalize these. And I tried them. I tried each one. I tried, well, couldn't validating A be more powerful than B? And maybe sometimes it did, but in general, this order was pretty true. I was impressed. All right, if you want to ask a friend for support in these ways, I guess one approach is asking, could you please learn this entire concept? But that's kind of hard for people. You can't expect them to do that all of a sudden. More practically, you can ask them prompts that get at each of these sections. So for these are, I guess, not just for the listening section, but for both. You can ask them to just listen to me. Can I talk at you? You can ask them to help you put things into words if that's what you're looking for. You can ask them to help you make sense of it, like validating, help brainstorm. You could ask them not to brainstorm yet, because people tend to like to do that step very early. Like, could you not brainstorm and just listen to me? Anyway, but now that you have this framework, I hope you can apply this to listening to friends and in asking for support from friends. And these are all listed out under the resources, so you can look them up later. All right, our last section here is about cognitive restructuring. So we've gone through, you've gotten into the introspective state, identified your inputs, you've processed your experience through writing or talking or one of those techniques. You've validated yourself or a friend has validated you. And next up is to refactor the code in your mind, to change your habits going forward. So cognitive distortion is a distorted view of reality. It's a pattern that our minds have that isn't totally accurate. Here's a list of the 10 most common ones. We'll go through some examples for some of these. I'm not going to get through all 10 today, but I have a reference for you with a whole bunch of these. The best way to illustrate is probably just to jump into the examples. So for the story I told you earlier, I was going to a meetup, hangry, wet, and late. I had some automatic thoughts, like wet shoes are the worst. I said that to myself. And then I noticed that was a type of cognitive distortion called magnification. I was blowing it out of proportion. Wet shoes aren't literally the worst, obviously. I heard myself think automatically, if I'm late, I shouldn't even go. And I stopped, I whooped, I noticed, and I considered which cognitive distortion is that one, because that sounds off. Eventually, I figured out it was all or nothing thinking, or black and white thinking, like going is okay, not going is okay, but going late, oh no, I can't consider that one. And the third example, I heard myself think, today sucks. This is a whole bunch of them. I was overgeneralizing the entire day. I was disqualifying the positive stuff that happened earlier in the day. And I was predicting that the rest of the day would also be bad, all based on this moment that I was in where I was hungry and wet and late. And I when I whooped, I noticed this thought and said, that has several cognitive distortions. Once I identified those cognitive distortions, I could counter the original thoughts on the left with some counter thoughts that I have on the right here. Instead of wet shoes are the worst, I thought to myself, I am feeling frustrated, which does not have the same ring to it. But that was the point. I tried to cut off the downward spiral from spiraling worse and worse. I told myself it's okay to go late. People do it all the time, and today can get better. This is hard to do. It was hard to stop. It was hard to notice them. It was hard to identify them, and it was hard to counter them. But I did, and I ended up going to the meetup and being pretty happy about it. It was a good decision. It was just a momentary state that I was in that I got through. So this handout is super useful. I recommend printing this or saving it to your desktop, and it's linked to from the notes. All right, we're at the end here. I'll give you summary stuff. The link that I shared, I'll paste it again here. The reference, I just put it in the Slack chat again. The links to the slides, the handouts on the website, the distortions list, a whole bunch of stuff. These 3 resources you can find through this part of the web page that it links you to, quick reference, suggested activities, worksheet. If you want to get updates, I'm always writing more articles and making videos and working on the board game. If you want updates on those, feel free to sign up there. I'll go through quickly the techniques that we went through. So you learned about the introspection using Woop. You learned about the 4 types of inputs, 2 types of process. All these processing techniques, talking to a friend or a duck or a cat or a plant, writing and reading. Validation levels. And cognitive distortions. For other tools, you should consider seeing a therapist. You can get over the stigma. Most people who are hesitant to go, but thinking about it, maybe it would benefit those people. You can consider the book Feeling Good, the CBT one. There are apps that help with mindfulness meditation. Calm and Headspace are very popular. For CBT for social anxiety, there's an app, Joyable, that I know some people who've used, and they like that a lot. Of course, my book is an option. printed book, ebook, audiobook, all three. And if you'd like to have more stuff like this, I do other workshops like a prioritization workshop, team health and psychological survey. So like taking the validation ideas and applying it to your team at work, and individual coaching. And this workshop we just did. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm on both a whole bunch.